Hello, hello, adventurers, and welcome back to the Dragon's Lair. Today, we will be talking about Aang from Avatar: The Last Airbender. It is important to note that the pronunciation of his name is, and always will be, Aang, not Ung, spelled with two A's. Apparently some people have problems with that. But yes, that lovable goofball will be the topic of today's video. So, let's jump right into it, shall we? Moving on to his first statistic, strength. Aang is a 12-year-old kid. He's not going to be super strong. That being said, for a 12-year-old kid, he's also not super weak. So I'd have to put it around 12 to 14, depending on generation methods and allowing for room for improvement. Moving on to his next statistic, dexterity. This is probably the most important statistic for benders in general, with the exception of probably earth and firebenders, depending on the way the firebender wants to bend. But for airbenders, this is the most important statistic. Now, air and waterbenders are going to need a higher dexterity than the other two, explicitly because of what their bending requires. But airbenders specifically, especially Aang, because as seen in the show, spoiler alert, I guess. We'll just go ahead and cover my bases there. 3, 2, 1. We should be good. As seen in the show, Aang tends to fight with the style of, I don't want to fight, if that makes sense. It's one of those, like, I would rather dodge and evade and not punch back at all.
What's the word? Pacifist?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. That's the way the monks raised him, was to do that sort of thing, from what I recall. So, I mean, it makes sense. Now, Aang will fight if he needs to, but he prefers not to. This is evident because of, and I'll go ahead and say it again to cover my bases, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. I mean, nothing's changed. We should still be good. There's the fight with Zuko over the well, where Zuko's making all these strikes and punches at Aang, and he's continuously dodging and evading with the threat of falling into the well at any given point in time. There is the fight at the school, the Fire Nation school, where the kid firebender is attacking Aang, and Aang is just continuously dodging and almost making a mockery of the firebender. Followed shortly after by the dance, where he and Katara dance, and it almost looks like fighting moves that were transformed into a dance, if that makes sense. But it's again one of those things where he's light on his feet and constantly moving around, that sort of thing. And the fighting style itself is evident in the way he acts up until the very last few minutes of the show, where he spends every second he can trying to find a way to not have to fight and kill Fire Lord Ozai. That leads into energy bending and one of the greatest points of the show. So that's how I get his fighting style. That's with all of those reasons combined, I have to put his dexterity, just because of who he is and what he does, at an 18 to 20. Just to make sense. Moving on to Constitution, it doesn't really come up a whole lot in the show, right? It's never really mentioned. There are very few times where it's used at all. For the sake of this, I have to define Constitution as an outside effect on the body's internal systems. So because of that, there are very few instances that I could see within the show where it pops up. One of which being the fact that he came out of an iceberg. He and Aang and Appa both came out of the iceberg and pretty much immediately sneezed. You're stuck in an iceberg for about 100 years. A cold is expected. I think it's fair to say. Wouldn't you agree?
I mean, it's like being a snowman.
Is it?
Kinda cold.
I see what you're going for, but I don't think being frozen in ice is the same as being a snowman.
I mean, they both just sit there.
Yeah, they do. I'll give you this one. Yes, he was frozen in ice for 100 years, so a bit of a cold, a bit of a sneeze is a bit expected. Moving on to farther portions of the show. For this, I'm going to go ahead and say spoiler alert. 3, 2, 1. We should be good. there is the bloodbending episode with Hama, where Aang and Sokka both are captured, essentially, when Hama starts to just use their blood because she can do that, apparently. Which, don't get me wrong, it makes sense in the show. It kind of led up to it. So it's not, I'm not questioning the show. I'm just saying it's kind of like, well, not a whole lot you can do there. And that brings me to the point of Aang and Sokka really didn't have much of a chance to avoid it. Avoid the external attack on their body's internal systems. It wouldn't have really done a whole lot. So I'd imagine it would be difficult in general if someone just started using your blood. I don't know. There's not a whole lot you can do there.
I don't even know how you would avoid it, really.
I mean, for the sake of D&D, there would be some sort of save, but logically speaking, I don't really think there would be much of a save.
You can't take water out of your body.
No, it doesn't work that way. So it's just one of those, like, well, kind of get the short end of the stick there, friend. Moving on to the next little bit would be the lightning, where Azula strikes him. Aang didn't redirect it, unlike Zuko did when he was struck at, I should say. But Aang didn't really have a chance. He was in the middle of the Avatar state. He was a little preoccupied. So, because of those three instances, I'd have to say that Aang's constitution is a 10. Because I don't want to say that it's low, because it never really comes up. But the 3 instances I have, the 2.5, I should say, where he sneezes after being frozen in ice, he gets his blood used, which doesn't really seem like a fair fight at all, and then gets struck by lightning. He lives, but from a lot of help. So it's one of those, he failed all 3 of the instances that were thrown at him, so I can't say that it's high, but because it doesn't really come up, and 2 out of the 3 instances were kind of unfair, I can't say that it's low either. So I'm going to say that his constitution is at 10, and it's kind of a flex. Like, it's just one of those that doesn't come up. But based on what I've got, it's not maxed. It's not minimized, but it's not maxed. So moving on to something that's a little more tangible, we're going to go intelligence, ironically. Something that you can't touch at all.
Fair.
So, yeah, there's the whole thing with it about how resourceful Aang is. But I would argue that resourcefulness ties in more with wisdom than it does intelligence. If you look at it, it's one of those, what can you do with what you've got on you right now? That's wisdom. Intelligence is knowing something about a different topic, we'll say. Wisdom is being able to put that into practice, or being able to use it in that instant, which is what Aang does. Now, I don't want to sit there and say that Aang has a very low intelligence, because the man is relatively smart, as long as he's not in the same room with Sokka alone. You put those 2 in a room together alone, and they become the very definition of my last 2 brain cells. I mean, that's just what they are. But overall, like, he's got a couple of different things that he does that's relatively intelligent. For instance, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. For instance, he helped come up with the idea to take down the drill tank from the inside. In the 2nd season is what it was. I forget the exact episode, but they were trying to get, the girls were trying to drill into Ba Sing Se, and Aang and Sokka together came up with the idea, Katara helped as well, came up with the idea to take the drill down from the inside. Although I must admit it was mainly Sokka's plan. From there, on the outside, the same episode, a few minutes later, Aang used the idea of a falling rock, making it into a makeshift nail, and being able to hit that down to be the catalyst, to cause the drill to break down from the inside. So there's a bit of intelligence there. I mean, you have to have the intelligence to come up with the idea, and then the wisdom to put it into practice. So the 2 skills kind of go hand in hand. But for this, I'm going to say Aang's intelligence is relatively lower than his wisdom will be. I'm going to put it at 14 to 16. Just because, 14 to 16, just because it's not as high as his wisdom, in all fairness. Speaking of the wisdom, let's move on down to that. His wisdom is going to be relatively high. I say this because he has the wisdom, the thought to, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, we should be good, to come up with the idea in the middle of a rock falling towards him to create a makeshift nail to be able to bring a drill down from the inside. He has the wisdom to be able to go and think up, with the help of a lion turtle, sure, how to not kill Fire Lord Ozai. He has access to all of the knowledge and wisdom of the previous avatars, and that has to count for something. Like, Aang was raised by monks. He has wisdom. It was instilled in him from birth. And the fact that he has a bunch of help with it, I mean, he is wise. He just is. So I have to put his wisdom at somewhere around an 18 to 20. Just depending. It could theoretically be a little lower, maybe 16, but I would say that 16 is the absolute lowest. I mean, given everything. Moving on to charisma. I mean, Aang has a lovable face. You see that within the first few seconds of meeting him. But there are glaring instances of terrible charisma and pretty big instances of really good charisma. So it kind of balances out. For example, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. An example of bad charisma would be bartering copper by copper with pirates. First off, this is just a bad idea, right? So that further goes to the intelligence as to why it's not quite as high. But let me just say something real quick. If you barter copper by copper, or electrum by electrum, if anyone ever uses that, for whatever reason in-game, you're a bad person, and you should feel bad. Stop doing that. No one likes it. Alright? You're not being cheap in-game, you're being annoying in real life. So stop it. But moving on. He barters copper by copper to try to convince pirates to give him a water scroll that he was trying to get. Didn't work. But he and the gang lie their way into a couple of different places. For instance, the Pippin-Paddle-Opsicopoulos family and the Fire family. You'll never really be able to say that straight through.
I won't be able
to. I mean, I've done it once or twice. And we've done how many runs of this?
10 too many.
I mean, we do dry runs, we do script reads. We don't really film too much when it gets down to it, but we do so much prep, and I've said it maybe once or twice all the way through. So it's just one of those, like, it's Pippin-Paddle-Opsicopoulos. If you're gonna say it, you're just gonna go for it, and it'll either work or it won't. So good luck with that. But yes, the Pippin-Paddle-Opsicopoulos family and the Fire family, they lie their way through doing that, but that's kind of a group thing. Aang, Katara, and Sokka all work together for that. But I'm willing to give it to them. Also, when you mention the fact that at any point in time, when possible, Aang has a group of children wandering behind him. This is evident in the Kyoshi Warriors episode and when they're in the Southern Water Tribe. But it's just kind of who Aang is. He's just kind of a cool guy. But then you get down to possibly the worst instance of charisma in the show, if not in existence, going a little broader. This episode, the Secret Tunnel episode, when Aang attempts and fails miserably at telling Katara how he truly feels. That's possibly the worst instance of charisma I've ever seen for any character at all. So there is that. Despite that, however, that does still manage to be one of my favorite episodes because of the Secret Tunnel song. It's just a really good song. You can't tell me that once you've seen the episode, you don't still sometimes hum it. Sing it when nobody's around, because it's such a good song. It's just funny. But yes, for Aang's charisma, getting back on track, I've got to put that at probably right around a 10. Because there are instances of good charisma, there are instances of bad charisma. It just kind of depends on the roles. So there is that. Moving down to the race and class. We're going to start with the straightforward racing class. You've probably already figured it out, my clever adventurers. He's obviously a human, right? And Way of the Four Elements monk makes sense. I mean, Avatar and everything like that. Now for this, I went with human variant, which is a little odd and interesting. You might not have seen that one coming. But what this does is it limits the number of ability score improvements you get to 2 different scores by 1 apiece. So there is a limitation there from normal. However, you gain an extra skill proficiency of your choice and a feat of your choice. And this is important. So the skill proficiency I went with, because Aang has access to all of the knowledge and wisdom of the previous avatars, I chose history. Because I think that knowledge should count for something, and history is probably the easiest way to equate it in-game. Now, moving on to the feat, I chose the Practiced Expert feat, and what this does is it gives you another bonus, like skill bonus of +1 to whatever ability score, there we go, that you would like. From there, it also adds another proficiency in a random skill of your choice. So with that, you could go with nature, arcana, perception even, just something, whatever you think fits most. Deception, if you think that my charisma assessment wasn't quite accurate. And then from there, you gain expertise in another skill proficiency that you already have proficiency with. And essentially what expertise is, for those who don't know, you just double the proficiency bonus. So instead of adding the proficiency bonus once, you would add it twice. That's why I chose the Practiced Expert. Now, it is worth noting that the Practiced Expert feat is Unearthed Arcana, which means you can't use it in adventure leagues, and your DM will more than likely need to sign off on it before they just okay it, before it's, like, actually cool. It's always good to check with your DM anyway, but especially for something that's not official material, like Unearthed Arcana. That being said, there's a feat called Prodigy, I believe. Yes. Prodigy, Chill is confirming. That is the exact same. Except it's not Unearthed Arcana, which means use it to your heart's content.
It's legal in Adventurers League.
Mm-hmm. That it is. So, that is the straightforward race. Moving on to the class, the Way of the Four Elements just kind of makes sense. Now, for the sake of this, I went to level 20, but it wouldn't be out of the question to go fighter, perhaps, until level 2 to get the action surge. I mean, it would make sense, it would work. It wouldn't do too much limitation. But the monk class makes sense, especially Way of the Four Elements, because you've got spells or things you can cast. It's technically expending key points to be able to do, but they are pretty similar to spells, and in fact, I think most of them are spells that already exist. For the most part, at least.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if every one of them is, but I think most of them are spells that are just equated to monk.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. But you have things you can cast, and that mirrors the bending of the four elements on Aang's part, because they are elemental spells. I say spells and casting quotation marks because technically you're a monk, you're not casting, you are doing. Slight difference. You expend a key point and you're able to do the effect, whatever it may be. So it's not technically casting a spell, but it is the same, effectively, in D&D as casting a spell. So yes, it makes sense with monk, especially because you gain the ability to run on water, walk on walls, all things Aang is seen doing relatively early on, because he is an airbender. In, like, episode 3, he's running on walls. And then, when you're a waterbender, you can just bend it to where you can walk on water. It makes sense. So, there is that. And the fact that Aang is 112, subtle jab at this. Monks gain the ability to not age as much. At least not show age as much. Admittedly, druids do this better, but for monks, it just kind of, it makes sense. It goes with it. So, there's that. Now, for the conceptual build of Aang, if you want to get away from the monotony that is a human in D&D, you have a few options. First off, there's the Ganassi, which I looked it up. That's how that's pronounced.
Good.
Yes, I'm being very careful to make sure that I pronounce everything correctly.
Yeah, it's nice.
It is. I appreciate it when people do that. So it's just one of those simplistic thing that I can do that just gives it quality.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, Ganassi. That it works with it, but it doesn't make sense for the avatar explicitly because he bends more than just the one element. So if you're locking him into that, which theoretically you wouldn't be locking him in, you could still bend other elements. But if you go Air Ganassi because he's an airbender, well, he's also a water, earth, and firebender, so there's that too. The one I would go with for this is the Aasimar Scourge or Protector. And yes, I looked that up too. Aasimar is how it's pronounced as well. In American English, at least. So, there is that. But that makes sense, and both of those races and technically sub-races gain benefits that mirror the Avatar state. They're not exactly like it, but they do mirror the Avatar state. So that was kind of a main determining factor. And it goes with the idea that Aang is a little more than human, a little more divine, a little more spiritual. It kind of makes sense that with that for Aasimar. So that's why I would go with that one instead of Ganassi. Although it is feasible to go with Ganassi, which is why I mentioned it. Moving on to the class. Any caster class would work. I would probably choose Druid. Here's why I would choose Druid for the conceptual build. It makes more sense, in my opinion, than Monk. Aang doesn't really punch anyone, ever. Not that I've seen, and maybe he does a couple of times and I just don't recall. Like, I'm not recalling right now. But he gets in fights, and when he does, he more dodges and evades. He's hard to hit. But when he strikes, it's more bending. There's never a physical punch like someone like Ty Lee or May would have to do. So that's why Monk makes sense, but not particularly. Druid makes more sense for the conceptual build because he doesn't actually physically strike anyone. When he does, it's more bending. So there's that. Druids get access to nature-based spells, which makes sense for bending of the four elements. That being said, so do sorcerers and wizards, and any really casting class. They gain access to elemental spells as well, so it is feasible to do a build where you are a wizard or sorcerer and you just choose elemental spells. That's also possible. So that's why I said any casting class. And you can always, if you're looking to multi-class, you can multi-class into the casting classes, although keep in mind that gets a little redundant, and then you don't gain as many benefits. If you are looking to multi-class, you can multi-class into fighter and gain that action surge, which makes sense. It would just help you in-game to be able to do more, really.
Yeah.
Is what that boils down to. So, yes, there are the builds. Moving on to a bit of a backstory. So, without spoiling a whole lot, Aang was frozen in ice for 112 years, or 100 years, making him, technically speaking, 112 years old. So, there's that. He was discovered by Katara and Sokka while they were one day fishing for their tribe. Upon being discovered, essentially, he makes friends with Katara and Sokka, and then, to extent, the rest of the Southern Water Tribe, somewhat. The relationship's a little rocky in the beginning, but it works out. So there is that. From there, as their grandmother puts it, all three of their fates are intertwined. So the three that now make up the gang go off to teach Aang the rest of the elements. Moving on to items. There are very few items that Aang gets in the show. He has his staff and his whistle. For the sake of this, I'm going to call it the Staff of Flying. and the whistle of animal calling. So starting off with the staff of flying, what this does is it allows Aang to control the air currents around him to allow for flight. Now, in the show, it's unlimited, right? As long as Aang is conscious and is able to keep from crashing, he can control the air around him to where he can fly infinitely. He's an airbender. Now, limitations for this may include a number of times per day that the character can fly, and or a set number of, or set duration of time where the character can fly. So, for instance, you can fly 3 times a day for an hour apiece, right? Or you could have it to where once a day, or an unlimited number of times a day, you could fly for a total of 2 hours. To give verbal examples of what I mean, that are hopefully a little less confusing. Then there is the Staff of Flying 2.0. This staff is better in almost no ways, let's be honest. It's the exact same as the Staff of Flying, except it has a snack compartment and is blue instead of orange. So do with that information what you will.
Snacks are pretty important.
I mean, yes, you are right. I'm not going to argue with that. Snacks are always important and valuable. Moving on to the Whistle of Animal Calling. This one is a little more interesting. What this item does is it allows the whistler to make an animal handling check to animals. On a success, the animals are called to the whistler. On a fail, the animals may choose to remain where they are, they may choose to run away, or they may choose to attack, depending on what animal is called. The DC for calling the animals depends on what the animal is. So, like if the whistler's trying to call a Tarrasque, because I think technically it's an animal. It's at least close. It may not be a beast, as they're called, but like it's not human, so there is that. I don't remember the exact name, like category it fell under.
I think it would be beast, but I mean...
I'm not exactly certain, and I don't want to say...
animalistic beast.
Yeah, that's my thought, which is why I as a DM would allow it. You as a DM don't have to. But the DC for calling that to you is going to be very difficult. So it goes along with it. But if it's something simple like a deer, it's going to be a little easier to call. So the DC will vary. Limitations on this item may include not being able to call a Tarrasque. Came up with that one on the fly. It also may include a number of times a day that the whistler may be able to make a check. So they may only be able to whistle into the whistle 3 times for every long rest, every 24 hours, something along that line. So, with that being said, I believe that is all I have for you today, my fine adventurers. What are your thoughts? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think something should be changed? Have an idea that I may not have mentioned? Leave it down in the comments, and I'd be happy to read it, and you may just help a DM struggling to be able to balance their campaign. Links to my Discord and social media are all in the description. So if you just can't wait until the next video releases, which, by the way, will be on Katara, the waterbender, check those out. But other than that, I will catch you guys later.